Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, myself and Brian Shoulder, who is also part of our Alumni Network board, will be walking through the beers that we're going to taste. We'll talk a little bit before we dive into the tasting, just about some beer terms and some of the things that we're going to go over during the tasting. If you weren't able to get all the beers, that's okay. You can participate with whatever you have. I will mention that if anyone has any of the alternative beers, if they weren't able to get the first choice, I do have one of everything, so I can always taste one. All you have to do is let me know. We did have about twice as many people as are on now register, so people may be joining us as we go through this. That's okay too. We'll catch people up. I thought I'd introduce myself, and then Brian can introduce himself. And then what we're going to do before we dive into the tasting, we're going to just talk about some different things related to beer, and then I'll jump into what we should be looking for when we taste each beer, and then we'll go from there. So in the registration information, I had included that I've been a home brewer for 7 years. So I've been brewing my own beer. I'm part of a homebrew club. I'm also the president of the homebrew club right now. So I just brew the beer at home, and I ferment it and I carbonate it, and the month after I start, I've got 2 cases of beer generally. Some are good, some are really good, some are not so good. Brian's had some of my beers. I think he's liked them for the most part. I've also been a certified beer judge for 2 years. In the homebrew community, we do competitions. And one of the things that they need is people to judge the beers, and we judge them anonymously. We go through a similar procedure as we'll do today for the tasting of the beers, except we fill out score sheets and we assign points, and it's a comparison of if you're drinking a flight of 10 pale ales, you have to assign numbers for scoring, and you have to be picking out certain characteristics that are supposed to be there for that particular style of beer. And as we dive in today, you'll see what I mean, because with each of the styles, I will read from the guidelines that we use in competitions, just so you have an idea of what to be looking for. All kinds of things can go wrong when you're making a beer, and so we have to try to pick out, what is an ideal beer for that particular style. I'm going to let Brian introduce himself to talk a little bit about his beer background, and then we will dive in. I put together a little agenda that Brian and I will go over, and then we'll start tasting.
Class of 92. I'm also a member of the board in the New Jersey Terp Network. Along with Rich, I'm the treasurer, and I've brewed with him a few times. My experience is much more in the tasting of the beer. I've been to a lot of craft breweries. I've been very involved in that scene and enjoying it for a very long time. I started to enjoy it very early because I got tired of the same stuff that we all always had, and was always the selections in bars, and I was always looking for something new. So I would go to a liquor store and see what they had and see if they had something interesting, and then I would just buy it, and it progresses from there, and it becomes a culture, and it becomes fun, and it's interesting, and you can pair it with food, and it's a lot of fun to taste all the different styles and all the different flavors and the different ways that brewers are trying to be creative, and you get a lot of enjoyment while at the same time having a nice buzz is fun as well. So on that note, I'm going to let Rich take us to the next step.
Okay. So first, I want to just make it clear, this is an event about learning how to taste beer. We're not guzzling beer. We're not planning to get drunk. It's how to appreciate beer. It's sort of like if you take a class on tasting wine. You can drink a glass of wine. You can pair it with food. You certainly can drink it if you want to get plastered. But the idea of this event is to learn how to taste beer for what it is. It is a beverage that can be enjoyed, and some of you may have some experience in this, some of you may not. Everyone's got different tastes and preferences. I tend to like hoppy, bitter beers. Brian's the opposite. He doesn't like those kind of beers. But we do have middle ground that we like the same beers for certain reasons. But this is really an appreciation class.
Right.
And the fact that we actually get to taste the beers makes it even better. And we may drink the same beer and pick up different things. We may find that one beer to one of us is more hoppy than another, and that's okay. I may pick up something that Brian may not pick up, or you may not pick up, and that's okay too. Everybody's palate will be different, and traditionally, something that I may pick up is just, it may be because I've been training myself for this, or it may be because I just happen to be able to taste something. Sometimes it's just not there, and that's okay. So this is meant to just be fun. Once we get into the tasting of the beers, hopefully everybody will get comfortable with how we're going to go through them. You'll participate. Don't feel obligated. If we start going through a beer and asking you to throw out what you're getting, if you're not really getting something, that's okay. If you get a lot and you get something totally different than what we get, that's okay too. And it may be there, it may not be there. It doesn't matter. So Brian had a number of things he wanted to go over in terms of resources, in terms of the beer community out there. So I'm going to let him talk about that a little bit.
So yeah, one of the things that I wanted to mention was that when we're able to, and in some places you can, some places you can't, some places there you can sit outside, but if you have the opportunity, you should visit your local breweries. It's a great opportunity to socialize when you can. It's a great opportunity to try their beers and see what they have and to enhance your enjoyment of it. I mean, one of the things that I particularly like to do is I like to get flights, which is like basically a 4-ounce or 5-ounce pour of 4 or 5 different beers, so that even if there's something that you find that you don't really like, 4 or 5 beers is not so much where you won't really feel that you need to pour it out. You probably will be able to enjoy the whole thing, and it's a great chance to learn the.
Take a look. Athena's holding up a flight of tasting glasses.
Nice. I have the same. I don't have the board, but I have the tasting glasses as well. Very nice. And it really just, it's a chance to see also what you like and what you don't like. And if you're someone like me or like Rich, you want to try everything. So we tend to try things that we don't normally like, so we can see what goes into the craft and what they're trying to accomplish. And you know what? That's how you learn and figure out. Like I don't particularly like hoppy beers, like Rich said, and there's subsets of IPAs that are now very popular, which I love, but a regular West Coast style IPA, which is very hoppy, I don't enjoy. But I'm willing to try them because I want to see what goes into it. So that's one of the first things. Also, there's a lot of online resources and places where you can find information about the craft beers. I tend to use Beer Connoisseur. I'm a subscriber via email, and they will give you, what different breweries around the country are doing, what a specific beer might be, how to compare styles. There's all sorts of different articles that they have, every day, as well as other places where they will send you to go for additional information. And there's other places like Beer Advocate, and Rich and I are part of the New Jersey Craft Beer group, and there's also Facebook groups that you can join. I'm a member of a number of them where people will show you what they have. And a lot of times you can't get these beers because they're at different places around the country, but there's different services like Tavor and other delivery services where you can order some of these beers, things that sound really interesting to you, whether it's a sour or a stout and different things like that. One of the other things that I tend to do is I record what I view as how I think a beer tastes. And it's called, the one that I use the most is called Untapped. And there's a whole community of people on there. And that's a great place to look. There's also Beer Advocate and Rate Beer, all sorts of different places that can give you an idea of what goes into the beer, what the tastes are, what the style is. Because you may be somewhere and you don't know what it is. You don't know what people think. And there's sometimes been beers that I've been in a place, I'm like, this sounds like it'd be amazing. And everyone gives it a 3 out of 5 or a 75 out of 100, depending on which service you're using. Or other times something doesn't sound so great and everyone's giving it a 5. And you're like, well, I got to try that one. So there's a lot of resources. When we're done with this, if you want to connect with either one of us on these resources, especially Untapped, please, by all means, go ahead and and reach out to us that way. This way you can see what we're tasting and what we're doing. Rich, I'll
Thanks,
bring it
Brian.
over to you.
Yeah, now I want to jump into just a couple of basic terms, some things that you should be aware of if you're not already. Starting out with what is in beer. Most beer is very simple. It's got 4 ingredients: malt, hops, yeast, and water. And there can be a combination of different malts, different hops. Not too many beers will have different yeast unless it's something really complex. But you can vary the beer and the taste based on just adjusting the different types of malts used, different types of hops, the amounts of each, and different recipes will be very similar, and you can just change, say, one of the hops that are used, and you can have a completely different beer. So that's number one. Number two, there are some terms that we just thought would be real basic to go over. You probably have heard of ales and lagers. They're both beer. It's just the way that the beers are made. It has only to do with the way they ferment. So ales are what's called a top fermenting beer, and lagers are a bottom fermenting beer. The yeast for ales floats on the top, and that's how the fermentation occurs. Whereas with the lager, the yeast actually ferments on the bottom of the beer. So once you brew the beer, whatever vessel you're putting it in to ferment it, once you add the yeast, depending on which type of yeast you're using, that is how it will work. That's the only difference. Okay, it's not that ales are one type of beer, lagers are another. Certain styles fall within one or the other, but it really just has to do with the way it's made. It doesn't indicate that it's good or bad or indifferent. It's just the way that it's differentiated. Another thing I wanted to make mention, which probably a lot of you are familiar with, is the craft beer movement versus what we call mega breweries. Mega breweries would be like Anheuser-Busch and Miller and Coors. The craft breweries would be all your little local breweries. Even some of the beers that we're going to have today are larger breweries, but they're still considered craft. So Sam Adams and Dogfish Head actually merged their companies. They are now the largest of all the craft brewers. So one of the IPAs that I had mentioned for today is by Dogfish Head, and the other IPA is Stone, which is another of the larger craft brewers. These companies all started small and then got bigger, and some got really, really big, and others never got very big. In New Jersey right now, there's over 100 breweries that are considered craft breweries. So Anheuser-Busch in Newark does not count as a craft brewery. The oldest and largest in the state is Flying Fish. That's down about a half hour outside Cherry Hill. And they've been making beer for, I think, almost 20 years. Might be a little bit longer, a little bit less, but it's around there. And initially, they didn't really distribute up here, and now they distribute all over as well as beyond New Jersey. So that would be an example of a larger New Jersey brewer, but on a scale nationwide, they don't compare. You know, they're not up there with Dogfish Head or Stone or New Belgium, which is another beer I had on the list today. Those are some of the larger ones. The other term I just wanted to go over, which really is pretty self-explanatory, is American beer versus international. And it used to be that there's a whole lot New York has the third most. Maryland, a little less than New Jersey. So Maryland does not have that many. But over time, every state has increased, which is great. Well, for beer lovers, it's great.
And there's great ones in every state and every area.
Yeah, wherever you are, I would encourage you, if you do want to explore and check out some different beers, find a close craft brewery and just go and talk to them. Most people that work at the craft breweries and the owners, they're happy to talk about beer. And if you're not sure what you like, you just go and you tell them, this is what I normally drink and what I like. Tell me what you think. Or you could be going and saying, surprise me, give me something that I've never had before. And with the small breweries, what's also neat is they can do smaller batches of something that it may be really off the beaten path. Brian mentioned sours earlier. A lot of breweries tend to do some sours because there's this whole population that loves sour beers. A sour beer is not really like drinking a non-sour beer. It's got a distinct taste. If you've had it, you know what I mean. Some people love them, some people could care less. I never loved them until I started drinking a lot more, and I really started to appreciate them. Next, I want to talk about different styles, and then I want to get into what we want to be looking for in the tasting. In essence, styles are just put together because they're similar to each other, and they were really put into a manual for competition purposes. Like I said, I'm a home brewer, and we go to competitions. I judge competitions. I enter beers in competitions, and the styles are important for knowing where you want to enter a beer. If you brew a pale ale, but it doesn't come out with any hop presence, maybe you enter it as an amber ale, or maybe you enter it in something else, because it doesn't. A pale ale or an IPA should have some kind of bitterness, and if it doesn't, there may be a better place to put that beer. Just because you intend to brew something one way doesn't mean that's what the result is. So the guidelines were put together for competition purposes. What I'm going to do is, as we taste each different style beer, I'll read an excerpt from those guidelines so we have a sense of what to be looking for. Because I can say, tell me what you get in the malt, and if you don't really know what to look for, or you're not familiar with the terms, it may be harder to pick up. Whereas if I tell you, okay, we're tasting a pale ale, so you're probably not going to get a lot of malt, but you should get some hops. You could have a nice balance. You really want to be looking for that. The basics of tasting are pretty simple. There's aroma. Appearance really doesn't matter for our purposes today. You've got aroma, you've got flavor, and you've got mouthfeel. So the aroma, you're going to smell the beer. You're going to try to get some kind of presence of malt and hops. You could get some esters from the yeast. Esters are going to be fruity notes or spicy notes. With most of the beers that we're going to taste today, we should not get a lot of esters. We might a little bit in the California Common, where that might come through, because that's a lighter beer, so sometimes we get more that comes through. With the flavor, it's going to be similar to the aroma, where you're going to get something from the malt, you're going to get something from the hops, but with hops you get both hop flavor and bitterness once you're able to taste it. Can't tell the bitterness by the aroma, but you can in the flavor. If it's a bigger beer, you can get alcohol presence. I don't think any of the beers that we're tasting today are very big that we should get any alcohol coming through. In the flavor, you're gonna want to see a balance, meaning between the hops and the malt. How balanced is it for that purpose? Somebody just put a comment in the chat room that they're disappointed I'm not wearing a Maryland shirt. I didn't have any Maryland shirt with a beer logo on it. So I am wearing a Grateful Dead bear carrying a beer mug, because this is Jerry Garcia week. So I wanted to at least have some beer theme while I was doing this. The mouthfeel also, it's not part of the taste, but it is part of the overall experience. You'll have some beers that are lighter in body, some are heavier. Again, we're not doing anything that's really heavy, so it shouldn't be an issue. The carbonation, which is part of the mouthfeel, you will get a sense of the carbonation, and that will help in the lingering aftertaste. So that's something that at the end of your beer, when you've taken a couple of sips and you're pausing in between beers, that's something that you want to notice, because sometimes that helps in the aftertaste, sometimes it doesn't. Most of these should be fine because they're all commercial beers. In a homebrew competition, we can get some really nasty beers, so sometimes that is something that we pick up on. And then the only other thing is the overall impression. For our purposes, it's, did we like the beer? Did we not like the beer? Is it something that we feel is very drinkable, meaning you could drink one, and is it so good that you want to have another? Or is it something that, like I said, Brian isn't a big fan of bitterness, Is it something that's so bitter that Brian says, you know what, I'm going to have this 4-ounce sample and then that's it. I can't deal with this bitterness. You know, I'm the opposite, where if it's something is bitter, I can't get enough of it. I've only learned to appreciate a lot of the other beer styles because I started brewing, because I started doing competitions where you judge and you don't know what you're going to get. And the only way to learn and to get better in appreciating beer, and in my case for home brewing, is to learn about styles that you don't normally brew, that you don't normally drink. If I go out, I usually would order an IPA.
Right. The corollary to that is that I love malty and sweeter beers, and Rich doesn't like those as much. And it's an interesting dichotomy for when we go out and we drink together, and you know we're at the different ends of the spectrum, but we both can appreciate it in the middle.
Yeah. So those are the basics for tasting. Now what I want to do is go over some of the terms that you would use in describing each of these. So for example, with hops, hops can be dank, they can be piney, they can be floral. Is there an essence of any kind of flower? They can be spicy. I don't think any of what we have today should be very spicy. You never know, but I specifically didn't pick anything that's too spicy. It could be citrusy. You get a lot of citrus notes in hops. Anything from grapefruit to lemon to orange, tangerine if it's not really potent. Hops can be grassy. They can be minty. We may get an example of that if people pick up on it when we get to the California Common. Tropical fruit is another big one. Pineapple and mango and guava. Beers that tend to lean towards the sour side, you can get passion fruit and guava. That will come through. Stone fruit is another type of fruit that you'll pick up. That would be anything where there's a stone pit in the middle. So apricots and cherries and plums, those would be considered stone fruit. So fruit is a big part of what you're picking up from the hops. When you move on to the malt can be toasty, bready, crackery. The darker beers can be roasty. You can get caramel. When we taste the stouts and the porters, we could get coffee or chocolate. If it's lighter, it could be cocoa. Sometimes licorice comes through, sometimes toffee. So these are all different descriptors for the malt. Yeast, just for educational purposes, I don't think we'll really pick up on a lot of yeast notes. It can be fruity, so you can get citrus and stone fruit notes. What's usually very apparent from the yeast is what are called phenols, which can be that spice that you get. It could be leaning towards a vanilla, could be clove. A lot of Belgian beers have a very phenolic clove aroma and taste. The finish of a beer, meaning once you've taken a sip, okay, it's on your tongue and the beer's gone, but there's something else there. That's the finish, is an aftertaste. Does it linger or does it go away quickly? If it's a hoppy beer and it can have bitterness, does that bitterness stay or does it go away quickly? If it's a better balanced beer, it will not linger that long. If it's got a sweet finish, how long does that stay? Some of the stouts and porters, if they're very chocolatey, that is the kind of flavor that can linger into the aftertaste. Some of the terms we use, these are all different things we'll pick up, but then there are different intensities. Is it mild? Is it strong? Is it assertive and aggressive? Is it kind of weak? Is it well balanced? Is it the kind of beer, and we'll have a couple, especially when we get the amber ale, should be much more balanced. Malt presence and no hops, you usually get a nice and the overall impression, like I said earlier, is it drinkable? Is it complex? A lot of also contributing to it's the dark. We would start with the lower alcohol in general beers. So we'll do the stout and the porter first, and then we'll.
I told you to wait until he said.
Oh no, don't worry about it. If you already started.
You gave us an order in the email.
I know, and I said that's like not the order he's going in.
We can switch it up.
Yeah, I put that on there. It wasn't necessarily the order of how we're going to taste it. And the reason I'm switching it up is if you drink a really bitter beer, sometimes that bitterness stays with you, and then if you drink a non-bitter beer afterwards, it messes up your palate unless you really cleanse your palate well. So if anybody started, I apologize for that. Maybe I should have.
So beers are not like wine where you typically start light and go dark. Beers, you can start dark and go light, and that's not an issue.
Yeah, and it has less to do with the color and more to do with the characteristics and the flavor and what you're picking up.
The interesting part is, so the beers that we chose for the stouts and porters are a little bit lighter than what you may find at other places. Like oftentimes, if you're going to get a stout at a brewery, it's going to be much higher in alcohol, but Guinness is not a very high alcoholic or very heavy beer, and so that was why Rich chose to go this way.
Yeah, so why don't we do this? We'll open up the stout. If everybody got the Guinness, that's great. If you have the Murphys, just let me know, and I'll open that one too. Pour a couple ounces into a glass or more if you want. Swirl it around. Take a sniff, see what it smells like, and just jot down a couple of notes. And then after we do that and we taste it, then we will start to talk about it.
So you're going to talk about how the Guinness in this country tastes way different than the Guinness in Dublin?
I have not been to Dublin, so I can't say, but I have been told there's such a difference.
It's like when we went to Dublin, you know, we tried the Guinness there. Obviously, I liked it. I came back to this country, and I just don't like Guinness anymore. And I've liked Guinness my whole, drinking life until I went over to Dublin, and it ruined the Guinness for me in this country.
Yeah,
be careful. You might want to stay away from trying it.
I would be interested if you go to their brewery that they opened in Baltimore.
Oh, I've been there.
Okay.
Yeah, many times.
Is it better there than what we buy in the store or not?
It's different again.
Okay.
And they have so many different beers there that I usually don't get like the straight up Guinness. I get one of their like flavory beers.
Okay.
So.
Very experimental there in Baltimore.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. So I'm going to read a little bit about
alcohol content here as in Ireland.
I don't know about the alcohol content, that I couldn't address, but I can tell you they have different water there, and water is a huge component of any beverage. So the water just completely changes the taste of that beer when you're in Dublin. So I don't think it's so much that they're using different ingredients. It's just the water ingredient is different, is my understanding.
And I've heard the same thing with a lot of here is with brewery and have they're doing the stout. So I want to just read a little bit about what you should be picking up in the stout. So in the aroma, beer that you're seeing, this is just an Irish stout in terms of characteristics. Have to be there. Finish can be dry, coffee-like, moderately balanced. It can have wheat, which I definitely am getting. The chocolate that you're picking up can be all over the map. It can be very distinct. It can be mild. Same thing with coffee notes. And when we get to the porter, I think we'll have a little bit better idea of the coffee notes coming through. This beer, the Guinness, doesn't tend to be overwhelming with the coffee flavor, whereas some stouts it can be. Bitterness can be variable. Like I said, I don't really think this is a very bitter beer at all, even though it's roasty. That roastiness is more of a pleasant roastiness as opposed to a harsh bitterness that comes through. And as an overall impression, this is a black beer with a very pronounced roasted flavor, similar to coffee, but doesn't have to be exact. The balance can be fairly even to quite bitter. More balanced versions tend to have light malty sweetness. The bitter versions can be more dry. So in terms of what I picked up from this, in the aroma, I definitely get some sweetness coming through. I get moderate coffee. I don't get a lot of coffee notes. I do get moderate. and I pretty much get absolutely no hops coming through at all. It's all malt. It's all roasty. In the flavor, I do get a nice balance. It's sweet, but it's not overly sweet. I get the roastiness, but it's kind of on the moderate side. I don't get an overwhelming, in-your-face roastiness. I find the finish is pretty smooth and dry. I don't get as much sweetness in the aftertaste, even though as I was smelling it and tasting it, it seemed sweet. The aftertaste is really dry to me, and I don't get any lingering sweetness. Brian, what did you pick up?
So one of the reasons that we chose Guinness is it's really well described as basically the beer that a regular stout is supposed to be, an Irish dry stout. And I pick up a lot of caramel and sweetness, and it is very dry. And the funny part is I'm enjoying it much more than I remember, because I stopped drinking it a long time ago because I found it to be boring. But I'm enjoying it much more than I thought I would.
Yeah, and one of the things I'll mention before I open it up to everyone, when you study a beer and when you go through this process of really tasting it and evaluating it, you actually learn to appreciate a particular beer more, unless it's a style that you really hate. Guinness is one of those beers that before I really studied it, never cared for it. But I can appreciate it for what it is. It's a lighter stout with a really dry finish. It's got some sweetness. It's only a 4.2% beer, so it really is a light beer.
Right, it's dark but light. People,
the dark is strictly from the color of the grain.
Right.
Yeah, when we say we're talking 4.2, that's just the alcohol content.
Right. And what I was starting to say is people tend to get confused with stouts or porters because they're dark and they think they're going to be really heavy, and that's not necessarily the case. Oftentimes, like the Guinness, it is rather light. It's not a heavy beer at all, and it's quite drinkable. And that's the difference, where people don't always understand that. And that's one of the things that we're trying to get across, is so that people, when you go into a bar and you see, things don't necessarily have to be what you're seeing in front of you. You have to taste it and you have to enjoy it to see what it actually is.
Right. So let's open it up to everybody. Anybody who has some comments, just yell them out.
So I last had Guinness when I was about 16 or 17 in Ireland, and I hated it, and I haven't touched it since. I'm loving this. So thank you.
Well, that's great.
Might be my beer. And I love coffee, so I smelled that, I tasted that, I expected it to be heavy because it's dark. Right. But I'm really loving it. So, unless then don't start drinking too early in life, I suppose.
Rich.
Yes.
This is Karen and Mike. We got a different beer. We got a Southern Tier. Are you familiar with that?
Okay. Yeah, I am. And Brian, I think, is too.
We went to our beer place, and that's what they gave us. Or sold.
Okay.
And I too, like Gail, I hadn't even thought about drinking stout. I always thought of it as heavy and very bitter. Really enjoyed this.
Great.
Much more even, more balanced than I thought too.
Can you tell us which Southern Tier?
I'm sorry.
Which Southern Tier is it, Karen?
Times 2X Stout. I guess it's.
Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I have. I think I've had that before.
It says double milk stout.
Yeah. If it's a milk stout, it's definitely going to be on the sweet side.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
No, go ahead.
So I was going to say, one of my favorite beers, if not my single favorite beer, is an extremely sweet beer made by Southern Tier called Samoa This, which tastes exactly like a Samoa from the Girl Scout cookies put into a liquid form. It is a dessert beer, and it is to die for, in my feeling. I'm really sorry that it's very hard to get, very hard to get. Even in the fall and the winter, it's hard to get.
Southern Tier makes a lot of those kind of beers that are great dessert beers. Yeah, especially in the winter.
That's a Southern Tier as well, which is.
Yeah, I had that. I had that in Pennsylvania. I also like that.
I was saving it for later, but since you brought up Southern Tier.
Yeah, I really like Southern Tier beers.
Any other comments on the stout? Anything that people are picking up that we haven't mentioned yet?
Hi, so this is Mike and Azra in Baltimore. We actually had the Murphys.
Uh-huh.
I wasn't getting the sweetness as much, but definitely heavy coffee.
Yeah, and with the Murphys, I agree with you. There's less sweetness. I got a lot more toffee and coffee notes. Yeah, I got a little bit of milk chocolate, but it really wasn't overly sweet. And the aftertaste, it was a little on the dry side, but I thought it was like really nice and creamy. So it's a little bit different than the Guinness. They're both considered Irish stouts. They are a little different. I tend to like the Murphys a little bit better. I think Brian.
I do too.
Yeah, I think Brian, you had said you like the Murphys a little better too, right?
No, in fact, well, I'm drinking it now as well, as I got that too, and I'm not enjoying it as much as the Guinness. I feel
Really?
it's
Okay, interesting.
it's a lot
have to
thinner.
add Guinness.
It's good, but it's a lot thinner.
Okay. Yeah. So as we're seeing, you know, we're drinking the same beers and we're getting different preferences, picking up on some different things. A lot of times with the chocolate notes that you get, we will drink the same beer and just pick up on it differently. Sometimes it's much sweeter, sometimes it's less, even though it's the same beer. So what I like to do now is just move on to taste a porter so you can see a comparison of another kind of dark beer, but a porter is different than the stout. The one that I had mentioned to get is the Fuller's London Porter. That's pretty well available, so hopefully everybody or most everybody was able to find that. If not, you know, just let us know what other porter you've got, and we'll go from there. But just pour some into your glass, and let's go through the same thing. Smell it, taste it, write down some notes, and then we'll talk about it.
That's the one, if you could find that.
That's the pale ale, group 1. We started with group 3.
If you're so inclined, if you want to take a sip of water to cleanse your palate a little bit, that's always a good idea as well in between.
Substitutes for some of them, I guess. For that one.
This one I like okay, but I'm pretty sure. Yeah, we've got the
Sam
Edmund
Smith?
Fitzgerald.
Yep.
Okay, Sam Smith's is similar. Somebody had yelled out something else. What was that? I'm sorry.
The Edmund Fitzgerald.
Okay, you got the Edmund Fitzgerald. That's an American porter. After we talk about we'll jump over to the American. Nate says he's got the Sierra Nevada. That's a really good one. The American porters are a little different than the English porters. Of the two, my preference is the American porter only because it tends to have a little more bitterness coming through. The English porter tends to be more on the sweet side, or what I'll say, more subdued. A lot of English beers, the basic beers they're drinking every day, are actually lower in alcohol because they're meant to be, so you can go to the pub and just keep pounding them all day long. That's the nature of them. But this Fuller's London Porter is a really, really well-made English porter. Certainly my favorite of any English porter I've ever had. So who wants to start mentioning what you got from the aroma or the flavor? Okay, Becca also has the Edmund Fitzgerald. Brian, you want to start?
Yeah, so again, I'm getting some maltiness and some sweetness in the aroma, and the flavor. It is a little bit more bitter than what I found in the stouts, but not an overwhelming bitterness. To me, it's a very drinkable, very tasty beer. Still some roastiness, which I appreciate, but especially the maltiness. I like the sweetness of beer.
Yeah, I get very subdued characteristics across the board. So I get a little coffee coming through, but it's on the moderate side. I don't really get bitterness, but I do get some roastiness. I get a little bit of sweetness, but it's really mild, which is probably why I like this beer. I was getting, especially in the aroma, I was getting some mild dark fruit notes. They would be like plums or raisins. When you get into bigger dark beers, whether it's an imperial stout, a Baltic porter, barley wine, you tend to get a lot of dark fruit notes.
Or a Belgian quad.
Or a Belgian, it's actually called a Belgian dark strong these days.
Which is my favorite.
Yeah, you get a lot of that coming through. With this, you do get a little bit. But again, like almost every characteristic coming through here, it's all on the moderate side. It's only a 5.4% beer, so you're not going to get big, overwhelming notes. But as Brian said, it's nice and balanced, and it is very drinkable. I don't really get a lot of bitterness. When we get to the American, we'll see. Hopefully there's some bitterness. So what did anybody else pick up?
We don't have that beer.
There is no wrong answer.
Phil, since you have a similar one and you have Sam Smith's, what did you get?
Yeah, so it's a little bit different, but surprisingly sweet. You know, especially after the Guinness. Even the aroma was real sweet. Not overly so, but definitely noticeably, and but enjoyable still. It's easy to drink. Yeah.
And Samuel Smith makes some amazing beers.
Yeah, I'm just going to read the overall impression for the English porter. Moderate strength, brown beer with restrained roasty character and bitterness, just as I got, although I didn't really get the bitterness. Not burnt. I don't quite get burnt. I get very roasty, but not quite over the top to burnt. Often has a chocolate caramel malty profile.
The bitterness that I was getting was comparative to the stout, but it is not a bitter beer.
No. Yeah, you are right. And I get more caramel than I chocolate. Some people pick up caramel, some will pick up chocolate. There can be different levels, but it's not over the top. Those couple of you that had the Edwards in order, that have a little bit. Tell me there.
Than the Guinness was.
Yep, I agree. It's a little bigger beer. It's a 6% beer. I get some sweetness, but I definitely get a lot of roastiness. In the coffee, the coffee jumps out at me. An American porter tends to do that. Some American porters will have some bitterness coming through, but not necessarily. So it really depends on which one you have. I think somebody else also had the Edmund Fitzgerald.
And I'm tasting it as well now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we had it as well. Definitely feeling similar notes. Definitely feels like it tastes like a bit stronger, like I think they were saying. It's also a 6% beer for us.
Right.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying the aftertaste as well, and I guess the mouthfeel might be the right word for it, more so than the Guinness.
Yeah, the Guinness, and it's like night and day. The Guinness is a very creamy. The sweetness lingers. With this, again, an American porter is going to be different. It's not going to be as creamy. You will have more hops, so that helps with the mouthfeel, because even if there's some sweetness, the hops will repel that. So you're able to get it is a drier finish, in my opinion, and it is lingering in terms of that roastiness on my tongue. I really like it, and it's noted as one of the classic beers for this style. I think it might, I don't know if it was the first beer that Great Lakes made, but I think it's their best known and maybe has won the most medals for them.
And I
It's
think
really, really good American porter.
If I remember correctly, when we were looking up the beers that we were going to present today, I think this was rated as the #1 American porter on the list, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. So it's a really, really good beer.
One of the things that I thought made sense to bring up now also, because Rich was talking about it, oftentimes when there are coffee notes, people do sometimes confuse that with bitterness, because coffee has a sort of a bitterness to the flavor, and it's not always the case, but it can present that way a little bit.
Yeah, and that's also why tasting the beers and going through this exercise, I think, is helpful, because you're able to pinpoint those different flavors. And it's great that a few of you have said, you know, I didn't like this beer previously and I love it now, and I had it years ago and I'm tasting it again now, and you get a different appreciation. That's the benefit of this. And again, this is not what we did in college. You know, in college, it's like, okay, how many beers can we pound and get as drunk as we can get? This is so different. And that's why I love this as a hobby. And we're always educating ourselves. We're always finding new beers, so it never ends. We get excited when new breweries open up. They may have the same basic beer styles, but it's a new beer to taste. And several of the members of my homebrew club have opened breweries in the last couple of years. A few more are on the way. So we're able to taste some really interesting beers made by friends of ours, which is always fun. It's a hobby, and you really can look at it as something always to do that's always new, always interesting. You can always bring somebody new to a brewery that you've been to 10 times, and it's a different experience. I've met up with Brian at several different breweries, and every time we go, it's just different. So it's great. So let's move away from the stouts and porters. We're going to move on to the medium balanced beers. We're going to do the American Amber and the California Common. I love these beers only because these are the best examples of a little bit of everything. So for the Amber Ale,
before you move on,
yes.
So Mike also had this question, which I have too. So the difference between the porter and the stout. And I wasn't able to get any of the porters on your list. I got one from Bell's.
Okay.
And I thought I don't like it at all. You might like it. I think it's quite bitter.
Okay.
I didn't like it. But I can move on from that. But can you just a little bit about the difference between the stout and the porter?
Yeah. There's not a lot of difference. And for example, a lot of times with the stouts, the stout that we tasted is an Irish stout. That's the particular style. There's 7 or 8 different styles of stouts. So depending on what you get, it can fall into one versus the other. So one of them may be a very sweet stout, and one may not be a sweet stout. The porters and stouts essentially historically were the same kind of beer. And then they just spread off, and at some point, someone just decided we're going to call this one a stout and this one a porter. And actually, a couple hundred years ago, they flip-flopped. Everything started out being called a stout, even if it was a porter, just because that was the basic beer that people were drinking. So in terms of differences, there's not a lot of differences. There doesn't have to be. And if you're drinking one from Europe versus one from the U.S., can be very different. So it's more a question of the Irish stout that we drank can be very different than an American stout. American stout can have a little bit more hop character. So you get a little bitterness coming through, whereas the European stouts may not. Same thing with the porter. And in this case, we compared the 2 porters, one from England, one from the U.S. And the one from the U.S. had a little more bitterness. It was a little bit of a bigger beer. So we got a little bit more of a balance. And like I was saying with the Fullers that I described, everything was very moderate. And part of that is it's a smaller beer. So at 5.5%, you're not going to necessarily get as much coming through. But it's also the way that they make the beer. It's really good because it's balanced. Whereas you can have a porter with, and we didn't get to taste the Founders Porter. The Founders, I find, it's a bigger porter. It's got a lot more bitterness coming through. The aftertaste on that is very roasty, and that bitterness lingers. Whereas in most porters, you're not getting any lingering bitterness. So it's not so much that they're very, very different. They're really very similar. And in an overall sense, stouts and porters, when we do a competition, sometimes they're thrown into the same judging session only because if there's not enough of one or the other, we have to add them, and it's similar enough that you can judge stouts and porters together and be able to determine which one's a better beer. So
I'm not sure if you said this. I just looked up the differences, and the porters use malted barley, and the stouts are primarily made from unmalted roasted barley, which is where the coffee flavor most people associate with stout comes from.
okay, thank you for sharing that.
I actually am writing a game called The Game of Distinction, which has word pairs just like that. So
Oh, okay.
I'm very curious.
That's awesome. Yeah, but when you get down to the level where craft brewers or local brewers are just coming up with their recipes, they don't really have to follow any guidelines. They can do whatever they want. And so they may call something a stout, and it may taste to you more like a porter that you've had. Of what we're going to be tasting tonight, that's the one area where the two styles are really, really similar in terms of the taste. Now we're going to get to some that really are pretty different, similar enough that we're going to compare them, but different enough where you should be able to see real distinction. So what I was saying, we're going to start out with the amber ale, the new Belgian Fat Tire, which I don't know if it's the most popular amber ale, but it's certainly one of the most well-known. And since they started distributing in the East, they built a second brewery in North Carolina, so now they are nationwide in terms of the distribution. We never could get them here in New Jersey until a few years ago. So if somebody is drinking one of the other amber ales, let me know. But we're going to just walk through this as if everyone's got the Fat Tire. So pour some Fat Tire. Let's walk through this, write down some notes, and then we'll compare what we get.
We do. We have the Troggs.
You have the Troggs? Okay.
That's going to be a little bit different than the Fat Tire in that it's a little bit hoppier.
Yep. And we'll after I run through the Fat Tire, we'll talk about the Troggs, which I happen to love, and I've been drinking for a long, long time. I see Nate is saying he's got the Bells. That's also a little bit different. These are 3 American amber ales, and they all definitely taste a little bit different. I'm going to read through some of the characteristics of what you should be picking up on. So an American amber is a hoppy, moderate strength beer, caramel, malty flavor. Balance can vary, meaning that it can be very well balanced. It can be more malty. It can be more hoppy, to the point where it could be aggressively hopped. In terms of the aroma, you may get a low to moderate hop aroma. Whatever notes you pick up can be anything. It can be citrus, it can be floral, it can be tropical fruit, stone fruit. It all depends. In terms of the maltiness, it can be on the lower side, it can be on the higher side. And again, these are 3 very different beers, even though they're all in the same style. Generally, you're not going to get a lot of esters coming from the struck out on the amber. Okay, so someone's got an Avalanche Amber from Colorado. Well, you'll have to tell us what you think of that after we go through this.
Oh, so Karen, the Anchor Steam is the next beer that we're gonna taste to compare to this.
And I'm going to get crazy and open one of each, even though I've had them all. Just because there's at least one person that has each one. I want to be as up to date in my description as possible. Well, when I put the beers together, I had to get them all and taste them, and so I absolutely knew what each one was and why there were differences. And I jotted down some notes, but it's different if I'm tasting it right now. Okay, so let's start off. Let's talk about the new Belgian Fat Tire. Who wants to share some ideas? What did you get from that one?
I'll go first, and this is really strange, but I tried this about 5 years ago. I forget which state I was in, but it wasn't here though. And I did not like the smell. I still don't like the smell. I'm not sure what it is, but it turns me off. But I like the taste.
Okay.
And I like that medium hop that you talk about.
Right.
And I taste the fruitiness, but there's just something about the smell that I just don't like, and I'm not sure what it is.
Yeah, that's interesting. To me, I don't get a whole lot of aroma on this at all. But I was about to say, if you go and order a beer in a bar and you don't like the smell, you're probably not going to drink it.
Right.
I would probably drink it just because, exactly like you just experienced, the taste was pretty good, even though the smell wasn't great. You never know, unless it's so off-putting that there's no way you can stomach it. But
I really like the taste, though.
Yeah, I don't get a lot in the aroma at all, so to me, it's not off-putting. I get a little sweetness. I get more toffee than caramel. I don't think it's heavy enough to be caramel. But I certainly don't get that reaction. Anyone else on the aroma?
I guess I kind of got a breadiness or a yeastiness in the aroma, which it doesn't really come through in the flavor so much. But I mean, that was the only thing I could really identify in the aroma.
Who's talking? Is that Athena's guy?
That's
Yeah,
my guy.
Thank you. Because you
My guy, 35 years.
Thank you very much. I thought I was crazy. Okay.
Yeah, and actually, the balance in this, I think there's a little more towards the hops than it is to the malt, and that may be why you're not getting it as much in the flavor. The hops are just overwhelming that very light, bready, biscuity note. And that's the whole thing with the aroma. You don't pick up bitterness in the aroma, so you can get all of that coming through with the malt. And a lot of times, once you take a sip, it's gone. And the more hoppy beers that you drink, you really don't taste a whole lot of malt. It's there as support. When we get to the pale ale and the IPA, the pale ale will have much more support. The IPA really doesn't. But this is an interesting beer. Brian, what were your notes on this?
I smell some fruit. It's not overwhelming, the aroma, like you said, but I do smell some fruit and some yeast. I actually don't taste much hoppiness at all. In fact, I find it very balanced and absolutely delicious. Very caramelly, very malty, and right up my alley.
Yeah, I do think that it's balanced, and I don't know, maybe I have a preference for hops, so it's coming through to me. But I tend to be just middle of the road in terms of when I'm reviewing a beer. I just get a little more bitterness that comes through, and that helps with the dryness in the finish. But it may be that you're just not picking up on the bitterness.
No.
Anyone else? Okay, so let's move on. One or two of you had the Troggs. Why don't we talk about that?
I get a heavy grapefruit with the.
Me too. It's very in your face. Are you able to pick up anything from the malt?
That's where I'm having a bit of trouble.
Okay. In the flavor, the citrus, the grapefruit, that just the bitterness overwhelms the malt. I happen to love this beer because it's not a traditional amber ale. The first time I made an amber ale, I actually added a lot of extra hops when I dry hopped it, so it came out a lot like this, which is what I wanted. I do get in the aroma, the grapefruit notes are very prominent. I get a little piney note. A lot of times with hops, you will get a sense of pine. Think about if you're out in the woods and you're in a bunch of pine trees, you just inhale what that would be. That's what you can pick up from some hops. This is a little bit more one-dimensional versus the Fat Tire, which was very balanced. If you like this flavor, it's great. The malt is very light. It's definitely there. Again, I get more toffee and less caramel because it's not as big and heavy. But it's a dry finish. It's nice bitterness. It's not overwhelming. It's not the kind of bitterness like when we get to an IPA, it can be overwhelming. It's an American amber ale. It's only a 6% beer. But because they purposely made it extra hoppy, it's a very different beer than the Fat Tire. So whereas Brian likes the Fat Tire because it's not overly hopped, I love this because it is. So that's my take on the Troggs. And moving on, so one or two of you also had the Bells. So what did you pick up with the Bells? Did somebody have the Bells? I saw Nate, did you have the Bells? Bells is not too hoppy, more malty. Yeah, I think the Bells is more on the sweet side. I don't get a lot of hops. It's a nice toasty malt. This one does lean more towards being caramelly because that's where the sweetness is coming through. To me, in my opinion, I can drink this. I'm not as happy with it as the Troggs or the New Belgium. Even though I like something that is a little on the bitter side, to me, this is also a thinner beer. It's almost identical in the alcohol content as the Troggs, but to me, the Troggs is just a much better made beer. The mouthfeel is not as thin. It's more medium body. But the Bells, it's a good beer. It actually was their flagship beer, meaning it was the first beer that they put together. They're known for making some really good hoppy IPAs, which I prefer their beers. And Bells also has only been in New Jersey a couple of years, so I really hadn't had this beer very much. I think this might be the third or fourth time. It's a nice amber ale. I put it on the list because I knew that they distributed all over, so it was easy to get to or find. But to me, it's okay. You know, if I was rating it, maybe I'd give it an 80 out of 100. Whereas the Troggs, I would probably give a 90 plus. The Fat Tire also a 90 plus. Again, even though they do present themselves differently, for what they're meant to do, they do it, and they do it well. All right, anything else on the ambers before we move on to the Anchor Steam, which is one of my absolutely all-time favorite beers? Brian, you have anything more to say about ambers?
No.
Okay, well said. So,
keeping it.
Everybody, grab an Anchor Steam. Put some in your glass.
To get it, I went to 6 or 7 different liquor stores and I couldn't get it. And I was told that a couple of them that they're having a difficult time with the distribution because they're one of the few that still delivers by train. And because of COVID, they're not able to distribute the way they normally would.
Interesting.
Yes.
By steam engine.
Get it? Oh, that's funny. I'm going to read the description before we even talk anything about this, only because this is not only is this a very different beer. Anchor Steam is a California common, and it pretty much defined the category. And there was no California common on a retail basis before this. this beer, you may get all kinds of different things. The overall impression, it's a lightly fruity beer with a firm, grainy maltiness, interesting toasty and caramel flavors, showcasing rustic, traditional American hop characteristics. So that one sentence of about 20 words has all kinds of things in here. Okay? We can might get some fruitiness. The malt is going to be a good backbone. It can be grainy. Not only is the malt going to be toasty and or caramel, but it's going to be an interesting toasty and caramel. So this is not going to be a typical beer. The hops are very different. And I last time I had one of these, I actually picked up on something I've never picked up on in any beer before, but it actually is in the description. When we get to it, I'll talk about that. So this can be anywhere. You may pick up on any of these characteristics and you won't be wrong. In terms of the aroma, again, showcasing rustic, traditional American hops, often woody or minty. Can be moderate or can be high. So this could be a hoppy beer, may not be a hoppy beer. Light fruitiness is acceptable. So you may pick up on some fruit, you may not. Either way, it's okay. Low to moderate caramel. Low caramel would be you just get a hint. Moderate means it's definitely present and you notice it. It could be toasty. A couple of the beers that we tasted, some people had mentioned some bready notes and some toasty notes. That could be here. It may not be here. It should be well balanced, but you may find that it's a little more hop forward by tasting it. Now, one of the difficulties always is, depending on how old your beer is, a lot of times with hops, over time, those hops will dissipate and they will not be as prominent. So if you like hops, you want to drink a hoppy beer fresh. If you don't like hops and you have a hoppy beer and you let it mellow and age, you actually would enjoy it much more. And I'm sure Brian's done that a ton of times.
I've done it.
This is a kind of beer that if it's very fresh, you should definitely have a noticeable hop presence. So let's jot some notes down and then we'll compare. Okay, who wants to start? Got some comments. Anything? Okay, Brian, you're exempt from this one because you couldn't find it.
I am getting some spiciness, like coriander, maybe some pepper, like almost.
In the aroma or the flavor or both? In the aroma, flavor, or both?
In flavor.
Okay. Yeah, I get a little bit of spiciness. I actually do pick up on some of that minty note that they're talking about, which I've never had in a beer. But the last time when I was drinking this beer and going through what characteristics to pick up in preparation, it was the first time I ever got that mintiness coming through. And I thought, am I just getting that because it says it could be there? And then I had another one, and oh, Darren, take care. And I'm getting that now. It's something that I've never had in any other beer, but right in the style guidelines, it does say that it can be there. I actually like it. And it's something that I wouldn't think I would want in a beer. It's very subtle, but it definitely is there. I actually get it in not just the flavor, but also in the aroma. And You know, the aroma is hard because this is a light beer. It's only 4.9%, which is surprising. I get very light toasty malts in this, but I do get some mint coming through on the hop side. And this was one of the beers that kind of turned me on craft beer. And I fell in love with the beer. I went and visited the brewery 10 years ago when I was out in San Francisco. It was the summer they actually were selling it. The original owner was selling it to another company the week that I was there. But I got a tour. I did a tasting. It was great. I still love this beer. But I get some mild bitterness. It's not really, really bitter because it's not an IPA. It's not a pale ale. But there definitely is some bitterness I get. It doesn't linger long. I get a dry finish, but it's really not too bitter. So this is a nice beer if you want to introduce someone to craft beer where it's going to be pretty well balanced and it's very tasty. I've always looked at this beer as one of those beers to do. Some people, they like sweeter beers. Fat Tire is a good one to go with. But if they're not necessarily looking for something sweet or bitter, this is a nice beer. It's also not a big beer, so it's not going to turn people off. Any other observations on this?
Definitely, I thought definitely kind of unique, a little bit different, you know, middle of the road for the most part, but the flavor is, I want to say lively. Like I can't put my finger on a spice or taste necessarily, but just a lively flavor.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it just kind of pops. It's bright. It's what I would call a bright beer. Whereas we're drinking the stouts and the porters, I wouldn't call them bright. The roastiness kind of just sat there. It was, even though they were smaller beers, they weren't. It was more heavy. This is definitely bright. Very different kind of experience. Anyone else? Okay, let's move on. Now we're going to get into those beers that are or should be a little bit more on the bitter side. And like I said, I wanted to do them last only because a lot of times that ends up swaying your taste buds more so than they should be. So I'm going to cleanse my palate with some water in a Maryland cup. I got this a couple of years ago. The Alumni Association had a leadership conference, and this is one of the giveaways. I love it. It's got a straw, and it's got a top, and I use it all the time for water every day. So we're going to start out with the Pale Ale. Hopefully everyone got the Sierra Nevada. If not, Dale's Pale Ale from Oscar Blues is also a great Pale Ale. It's also available nationwide. We're going to start with the Sierra Nevada. A Pale Ale, and then when we do the IPAs next, these are showcases for hops. And hops can be any variety. They can bring out all kinds of fruity notes. But one of the things with hops is that's what provides bitterness in a beer. The Pale Ales, not so much. When we get to the IPAs, you'll see that it's a bit more. Although the two that I put on here, if not everybody got the Dogfish Head, the Stone is really a very different IPA than the Dogfish Head. But an American Pale Ale, this is what you should be looking for. It's pale, refreshing, hoppy ale, yet with sufficient supporting malt to make the beer balanced and drinkable. A Pale Ale generally will be in the 5 to 6% alcohol range. Should be very drinkable, should not be overwhelming on either side. Some of them can be more malt forward, some can be more hop forward. Again, I tend to like the hops, which is why I really like these. In a Pale Ale, they can use any kind of hops. So it can be citrusy, it can be tropical fruit, it can be stone fruit. Apricot's a great taste in a Pale Ale. In terms of the aroma, it can vary from moderate to strong hops. In terms of the malt, it's usually there, but it's very hard to pick up on. Can be caramelly, can be toasty, but you definitely, certainly in the flavor, going to have the hops as the predominant characteristic. But if the malt is there, it can be bready, toasty, biscuity, caramelly. You may get some fruit notes coming through. You may not. Again, everyone picks up on it differently. So take a sip or two or three, jot down some notes, and then let's talk about it. And this is one of the beers that really kicked off the craft beer revolution. This first was brewed in 1980. It's available in California at first, but eventually it got it around the country. It's known as one of the premier beers in the whole craft beer movement. Okay, Brian, you got this one, right? Why don't I let you start?
No real hoppiness in the aroma. The aroma is a little sweet, but it's nice. But in the taste, you can taste mild bitterness or I can taste mild bitterness as I'm drinking it, but it lingers on the palate after I'm done. For the most part, it's pretty well balanced. Other than that, the lingering is not, and it's not bad. It's not overly bitter to the point where it's, lip puckering.
So for someone like you who's not a big fan of bitterness, this is at least okay.
Yes.
Okay. In the aroma, I get some citrus notes. I get some orange and lemon in the aroma. Sometimes you have to go back to a beer. If you're pouring it and it's right out of the refrigerator, you need to let it get towards room temperature a little bit. And it's okay. Actually, as a beer warms up, you're going to get a lot more out of it. More notes will come through, especially darker beers, more so than lighter beers. But even with an IPA and a pale ale, you will definitely get more fruit notes as a beer gets warmer. I get that bitterness. It hits me right up front. It lingers, but it's not overwhelming. And so it's a pale ale. It's not an IPA, so it shouldn't be overwhelming. I wouldn't really call it a well-balanced beer because it's definitely hop forward, but it's very drinkable as a pale ale for someone that likes some hops but doesn't want to be put off by hops. So a pale ale is something that Brian can probably drink at least one, whereas an IPA depends on the IPA. But I get orange as the dominant citrus flavor.
I agree. Me too. I was thinking the same thing.
Okay, good. So I'm not crazy. Anyone else?
Well, that's debatable, by the way.
Well,
at least not for that.
Yeah, right. But the finish to me is very dry, and it's, in my opinion, again, because I love hops, to me it's very refreshing. This is always one of those beers that if I'm looking for just something really refreshing, maybe something I can drink when I'm preparing dinner, this is a great beer for that. It's a 5.6% beer, so it's not really big, and I like hops, so for me it's got a good hop presence. Okay, Mike, I see someone has the Dale's Pale Ale. We'll get to that in a second because I have that, and I've drank that a whole ton of times. I have a lot to say on that. Anyone else have some comments on the Sierra Nevada?
I get a resin, almost like a pine, but just more resiny.
See, I was getting that more of that than citrus as well.
Okay. I do get that, but I get the citrus still, in my opinion, is coming through a lot. So, now I'm pouring myself a Dale's Pale Ale. So a couple of you have that one. Let me know, for those of you that have the Dales, let me know what your thoughts are in terms of what you're picking up. I think whoever, if someone's talking, you are muted. It looks like everyone's muted. Okay, you get orange, you get hoppy.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Citrusy, grapefruit.
Are you getting grapefruit?
I feel like it tastes a little grapefruit, but it's definitely it's citrusy. Not as there was more grapefruit in the Troggs that I had earlier, but
yeah. I actually, I'm not really getting the grapefruit. I'm getting more orange and maybe a little tangerine when I'm tasting it.
Okay. Yeah, it's definitely different than.
Yeah, definitely different than the grapefruit notes from the other one. I like this. It's not overly bitter, but it's definitely got a little bit of bitter presence. The orange is definitely the overwhelming flavor to me, and it's really orange pith, and that's the bitter flavor. The pith of citrus fruit, that's where the bitterness comes from. So if I'm getting orange, it's really orange pith. It's not like a traditional orange. Karen's saying orange rind. Yeah, that can be bitter as well. So this is a pale ale. This is a little bigger beer. So this is going to be a little heartier. It's 6.5%. I like what they do with this beer because it's got some nice bitter presence. I tend to like it, but it is very well balanced. The malt is there. I get some really good toastiness. I get some caramel. This has been one of my favorite pale ales for years. At one point, I lived in Colorado. I couldn't get enough of it. I mean, it's a delicious beer. They also opened a second brewery. Actually, they have 3 breweries. They have one in Austin, but they also have one in North Carolina. So their beers are available nationwide now. Which is great for us in the Northeast when we never had these beers. But they make some very good beers. The funny thing is, I hate their IPAs. They don't specialize in IPAs, but anytime I've tried one, I really hated them. But I love most of their other beers. It's a strange kind of thing. Most good breweries can make a good IPA. They're not known for IPAs, and what I've had, I've been disappointed. Yeah, so these 2 beers, the Sierra Nevada and the Oscar Blues Dale's Pale Ale, these are 2 of the better pale ales. Obviously, if you get a pale ale from a local brewery, it probably will be really good. We have one here in New Jersey, a brewery called Twin Elephant that I go to a lot. They make some just amazing pale ales. A lot of their pale ales tend to be more like IPAs, so I like them. They also do a lot of New England style pale ale and IPAs, so I tend to like them. Brian likes a lot of those because they're not as bitter, but they have great flavor. IPAs. And was everybody able to get the Dogfish Head? Or did some people have to go with the Stone?
We went with the Stone.
Okay. So I will open both. And I am very familiar with both of these.
Open both anyway.
Yeah. We'll do the Dogfish Head first, and I will read a description of the American IPA. Now, again, with the description, it doesn't have to be exactly what the beer ends up tasting like. But this is the description. American IPA is a decidedly hoppy and bitter, moderately strong American pale ale showcasing modern American or New World hops, meaning any hop variety. The balance is hop forward. So with an IPA, again, it's not a New England IPA. It's a traditional American IPA. It should definitely be hop forward. It should have a clean fermentation profile. So we're not going to get any of these dark fruit notes. We're not going to get anything funky. It should be just very clean. It basically should be hops in your face. Now, some are a little more balanced. We'll talk about that in a second. You may be able to pick up a little malt. I almost never do because the hops are just so overwhelming. In terms of aroma, a prominent to intense hop aroma, as I'm saying, featuring pretty much any kind of hops. You could get citrus or floral or pine or resin, sometimes spicy, although not so much in an IPA. Can be any kind of fruit, tropical, stone, berry, melon. Some beers, some IPAs can be dry hop. And what that does is either during fermentation or after fermentation, more hops are added. Now that will not increase the bitterness. It will only increase in the aroma. So when you take an initial smell of an IPA, if it's been dry hopped, you should get an in-your-face blast of some kind of hop characteristic. Doesn't have to be bitter. It usually will.
To me, that's the before.
Which question?
She posted it on the chat.
Can you repeat it? Because I don't even know what it was.
Yeah, let me pull it up. It was, if something is hoppy, does that just mean it's bitter? And
yeah, not necessarily.
The hoppiness can be in the aroma, but not the finish, depending on the beer.
Right. And with New England IPAs, they tend not to do a lot of bittering hops. They will throw it all in later on, so you get some flavor, and then you get just a ton in the dry hopping, because you want to be able to really get a smell of what this beer is. So you get all these great fruit flavors coming through, but you don't really get bitterness.
This goes back to what we were saying before, that I particularly don't enjoy the taste and the flavor of the hops and the bitterness, but I love the aroma and the smells, and a lot of times you can really smell the citrus or the pine or whichever hops they're using.
Right. So you're a fan of the fruitiness coming from the hops, but not the bitterness coming from the hops. I like them both, but I go nuts for the bitterness. So with this Dogfish Head 60, this is considered a very hoppy beer. The 60 minute in the name of the beer comes from the way that they make the beer. They have a mechanism where they are continuously pumping in hops for a 60-minute period during the boil of the beer, and that's where the name comes from. They also have a 75-minute, a 90-minute, and a 120-minute. So they're continuously hopping this beer. This is an IPA, but as I've tasted more and more IPAs, it's not as bitter as others. It's really amazingly well balanced. What I get from this, I get a lot of orange. I get some grapefruit, but I actually get lemon coming through, especially in the aroma. I mean, that's something that not all beers will be like, but when you sense it, and it's not a bad thing, it's not like lemonade, but it's really pleasant. So that's what I'm getting in the aroma. In the flavor, I do get bitterness, but it's not overwhelming. I would call it moderate. It's definitely there. I get the citrus notes come through, and that actually is, I get that more than the bitterness. I don't know if anyone else gets that as well. Phil, you're shaking your head?
I was just going to say, I'm sure Brian disagrees.
The funny part is, I agree 100% with Rich, and I'm finding that this is so much more well-balanced than I used to find it, particularly after the years of tasting different, very hoppy, in-your-face, West Coast-style IPAs. This is not that at all, and this is a beer that's definitely drinkable for an IPA, especially for me, and I have a difficult time with those. I'm actually enjoying this beer way more than I thought, although I love Dogfish beers, so that's a whole different story, but I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah, LaShonda, you posted a comment in the chat box. You didn't like the flavor of it. What didn't you like about it?
Well, it's the strong hoppiness of it. Like as soon as you drink it, it's like bam, right there. But it's deceiving because you get like a nice citrus smell, and then you don't get what you smell.
With these IPAs, that a lot of times is the case, because the bitterness really doesn't come through in the aroma, which is why it can be night and day when you're tasting it and when you're smelling it first. And because of all the hops that are used, you get all these great fruit notes that come through, especially in the aroma. So it is deceiving, and if you're not a fan, you're not a fan, and that's okay. To me, this finishes very nice and dry. The bitterness is there, but it's not an overwhelming bitterness. So it's actually much more muted than I used to remember it.
Me too.
Which is why Brian likes it now.
And just so you guys understand, one of the things that does tend to happen is as you continue to drink beers, especially ones with a lot of hops, your taste buds do start to get attuned to it, and it doesn't feel quite as bitter as it used to. Although I still have a difficult time with the really heavily in your face bitter beers, but something like this does not really taste like that anymore. It tastes way more well balanced than it used to.
Yeah.
Well, what's your recommendation then? Because I always say I like IPAs, but then I run into the bitter IPAs, and I'm like, oh. When I first tried Sierra Nevada back in the 80s, I loved it. And I realized, oh, I didn't have to live with that bitterness, so I moved on. So I guess my bottom line is, what do you recommend as far as like figuring out, which IPA is best and not as, for me, not as bitter? Maybe I'm talking to Brian because Brian seems to have my taste buds more. But like, how do you know?
So the first thing I would say is, if that's how you feel, you should probably avoid the ones that are the West Coast style IPAs. And a lot of times they will tend to say what they are, something like that. You're better off with the pale ales. But if you're gonna go with an IPA, and I actually love the hazy New England milkshake style IPAs, because they do, like Rich was saying, it's much more in the dry hopping. You're not getting the bitter flavor. You're getting the hoppy smell and aroma, which is pleasant and nice, but you're not getting the bitterness. And also in those styles, they tend to use oats or wheat to mute some of the other areas that are so in your face. And so to me, I find that much more enjoyable. Rich doesn't like those as much as I do. He still likes them, but not as much as I do.
Yeah, and these days, because breweries are just experimenting with IPAs and how to change them, there are some IPAs just are not bitter at all. And a lot of the New England style IPAs, they're more juicy than they are bitter.
Right.
I love when there's a nice balance where it's a New England style IPA, but you get some bitterness that comes through. I mentioned Twin Elephant before. They make some just unbelievable New England style IPAs that do get that lingering bitterness. I had one a couple weeks ago, just phenomenal. I think Nate just posted something about
I see that.
Sloop's Juice Bomb, which I've had many times. It's delicious. All their beers are delicious. I visited their brewery a couple years ago.
I also like Flying Dog a lot. Also it's local.
Flying Dog, which is the largest brewery in Maryland. They make some amazing beers. In a couple weeks, Northern New Jersey is doing a happy hour with Flying Dog. We're hoping to get some of the beers and talk about them with one of the representatives from Flying Dog.
And you're all certainly welcome to join us.
Yeah. But I want to move on to the Stone, because I think at least one person had the Stone. And Stone is a little bit different IPA. It's a little bit bigger. The Dogfish Head, I should say, it was a 6% beer. Stone is a 6.9% beer, so it's a little bit bigger beer. But this one, for any of you that have it, let me know what you think, because it's a very distinct flavor.
Definitely one of my favorite beers, but it's definitely bitter.
I love it because it's got in-your-face bitterness. The citrus is just wow. It's really grapefruity, really lemony, and it's not what I'd call harsh, but I'd call it aggressive. Which, if you know anything about Stone, that's what they do. Even their session IPA, which I think is 4.5%, is so bitter and so out there. It's great. Stone is one of those great craft breweries where everything they do is so good. And they do make some non-bitter beers that I'm sure Brian has had, but they're known for their IPAs. This is one of the absolute best American IPAs I've ever had. Still to this day can drink it anytime. It's great bitterness.
It's my go-to as well.
Yeah, great. And where do you live?
We're in Baltimore.
And you're Baltimore, okay.
Yeah.
So Stone fortunately is nationwide. This has, to me, those traditional IPA characteristics. A lot of citrus, a lot of bitterness, some nice piney notes. It's very drinkable if you like hops. if you're not into hops like Brian, it wouldn't be the kind of beer that you would look at and say, yeah, I'm going to grab one of those. If I go out to a bar and I see they have Stone IPA on tap, I'm thrilled. I mean, it's different if I'm going to a local brewery where it's just their beers. But if I'm in New York City and I go to a bar that specializes in craft beer and they've got a Stone IPA and I don't want to drink something local, this is one of those beers I can always feel comfortable ordering, knowing that it's going to be nice, assertive bitterness. And that's really a good way to describe it. It's not overly aggressive where it's annoying, but it's assertive, meaning you know that it's there. Yeah, still is just an awesome IPA. So that actually gets us through all the beers, which is great. And I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed this. We're happy to stick around, answer any questions, talk beer, do anything. But this was something that we just put together because the university wanted us as a network to come up with some idea for Camp Diamondback, and Brian and I kind of looked at each other and said, let's do something with beer. It wasn't very hard, and it's sort of second nature.
Yeah, if I can add, we really appreciate you guys joining us for something that clearly we are very passionate about and that we enjoy, and it's something that Rich and I talk about all the time and enjoy with the music that we listen to and with Maryland. It all goes hand in hand for us. And by all means, if you want to know more, because this is really very introductory, there's so much more. It goes so much deeper. Please reach out to either one of us. If you want to connect with us on Untapped, please go ahead. If you want to connect with us on Facebook, please go ahead and ask us anything, anytime. You know, clearly Rich is the biggest expert. I feel like I know a bit, but he is the expert. But we can both be very helpful, and we're happy to answer anything at any time as it relates to beer or Maryland.
So what is the music that you feel goes with your beer drinking? I'm just curious now. What?
Any music.
Any music. Oh, okay.
Yeah, that I'm even more passionate about than I am beer.
So are you like pairing Beethoven with a porter?
There you go. I should try that. No, I mean, I can just listen to, I'm very particular when it comes to music, but you can listen to any kind of music and drink anything. Nate had asked a question about New York breweries. I love a lot of the ones in Brooklyn. My favorite is Other Half, hands down, because of the IPAs. But actually, up in New York State, we had a beer trip a couple years ago with my homebrew club. We hit Sloop, we hit Suarez, and we hit Plan B, which specializes in sours, which is just amazing. It's this little farmhouse brewery, and they do sours, and they do very strange sours. One was a pickle beer, which sounds weird, but was really delicious. Some of the bigger breweries, like Southern Tier, which is amazing. Southern Tier is great beer.
I still want to get there.
This is Nate's wife. I've commandeered the tasting now. I'm from right around Southern Tier Brewing. It's great.
Yeah. I mean, everything I've had of theirs is just terrific.
Have you had Ithaca beer?
Yep, I've had a
Flower
lot of
Power.
Yep, Flower Power is a very good IPA. It's a big beer. That's a 7.2 beer. That's one of the biggest IPAs, but that's a really good one. They make some good beers. And they've been distributing down in this area for a while.
Yeah.
You know, so what's interesting is not all breweries distribute everywhere, even if they're not that far away. So it's sometimes hard, unless you're at a bar in New York City where you can get access to it, are you able to get beers like that?
My best friend manages the tap room at Ithaca Beer, so we get exclusive access.
That's the way to do it.
Yes.
That's where you're going.
Yeah, that's why I'm excited that a bunch of my homebrew club members are opening their own breweries. So we have access to some good stuff.
We have a friend who's a home brewer, and he has a basement bar that's 12 taps, isn't it? He has 12 different home brews at any given time.
Yeah, a lot of my friends do that.
He won some national award for one of them. I don't remember what it was specifically, but yeah, he's a really good beer brewer.
Yeah, just as an aside, this year has been really, really tough for a lot of these local breweries where they've had to change their business model and they're not getting as many people coming in. They basically, it's all delivery and pickup.
Yeah.
And it's, at least in New Jersey, they now have outdoor seating. We don't have indoor seating yet. So it's really tough because these are small businesses for the most part. So it's really not been an easy year. But we'll get there. We will definitely get there.